Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Hey gang, my prom episode must have hit a nerve because I got a bunch of stories from people in high school, and I've chosen 4 of them to share with you here. Hope you guys dig them. So sit back, relax, and enjoy some true scary stories from high school. Scary School Trip, submitted by Brian V. In the spring of 2016, our high school senior class took a trip from southern West Virginia to Washington, D.C. For most of us, it was the first time leaving the state without our parents. We were all 17 or 18 years old and convinced we were basically adults, and our teachers made the mistake of giving us way too much freedom during the trip. There were 5 of us who spent most of their time together: Karen, Bart, Kathy, Paul, and me. Karen and Kathy were best friends and both on the yearbook staff. Bart was loud and always joking around and somehow knew everybody in school. He was a very popular guy. Paul was quieter and played on the football team, and I'd known him since elementary school. The 2 of us had grown up hunting and fishing together in the hills back home. So it was a really fun group to be hanging out with. Everybody was different, but we all got along. The first day in D.C. felt exciting instead of scary. The city was massive compared to where we lived. Back home, most roads disappeared into the woods or the mountains, but in D.C., everything felt crowded, loud, and fast. Sirens always going off between buildings, echoing, and traffic never seemed to stop moving. Even at night, there were people everywhere. Our school stayed at a hotel near Arlington, and on the second afternoon, our teachers gave us a few hours to explore the National Mall on our own, as long as we stayed in groups. We had no problem with that. At first, everything was incredible. We took pictures near the Lincoln Memorial and walked through the Vietnam Veterans Memorial while tourists moved around us in huge crowds. But the strange part started near dusk. We were walking towards some food trucks parked near a grassy area between monuments when a man called out to us from a bench. He looked around 50 years old with gray stubble and was wearing those mirrored sunglasses even though the sun was going down. He smiled too wide when Karen glanced his way. "You kids here for spring break?" Bart laughed out loud and told him it was a school trip, and the guy kept talking. He asked us where we were staying and whether we wanted to go to a party later that night with college girls and free drinks. Something about him immediately bothered me, and it wasn't just that he was older. It was the way he kept staring directly at Karen and Kathy while he talked, and barely acknowledged the rest of us. Paul noticed it too, because once we started walking again, he muttered to me, "Dude's a fucking creep." And we figured that was the end of it. But about 15 minutes later, we saw him again. This time he was standing beside 2 other older men near a row of parked tour buses. One of them was wearing a Washington Nationals cap pulled low over his eyes, and another had tattoos covering his neck and hands. They all watched us pass, but they didn't say a word. I remember Karen saying kind of quietly, "Why are they still here?" And nobody answered her because none of us wanted to sound paranoid. We just kept moving through the crowds back towards the Washington Monument. Every so often, though, I glanced behind us, and each time I caught sight of at least one of those guys somewhere nearby. Sometimes they pretended to look at their phones, and sometimes they stood talking to one another. But they were always there. Then the city started feeling a little bit different after dark. The tourist crowd thinned out, and school groups were heading back to their buses and hotels. The monuments were still beautiful lit up at night, but huge stretches of sidewalk suddenly felt isolated, despite being in the middle of D.C. At one point, Kathy finally stopped walking and turned to us. "You guys, they're following us." We all turned around, and we could see the 3 men across the street pretending to smoke near a tree line. The one in sunglasses, which he was still wearing, gave us a small wave when he realized we'd noticed them. Bart tried to make a joke about it, but he sounded more nervous than funny. So we decided to head back toward the nearest metro station where more people were around. And as we walked faster, the men started moving faster too. That's when a fourth guy appeared. He came out of nowhere beside a black van parked near the curb. He was heavy-set and bald with a reddish beard, and he smiled at Karen and called out, "Hey, sweetheart, you all still coming to the party tonight?" Karen ignored him and stayed close to Paul. But the bald man laughed loudly and said, "Don't act scared. We're just trying to show you kids a good time." I remember an awful pressure building in my chest. Every instinct was telling me something was seriously wrong. But at the same time, it felt impossible that anything bad could happen in such a public place. Then the van's sliding side door opened, and everything happened so damn fast, none of us could really react. The man in sunglasses suddenly rushed from behind us, and he grabbed Karen around the waist while another man lunged forward from the van. The guy slapped a hand over her mouth before she could scream properly, but I remember her eyes going huge with panic. And what still sticks with me to this day is the sound she was making, muffled behind this guy's hand, while her feet were scraping violently across the sidewalk. For half a second, all of us froze in shock, but then Paul exploded into motion. He slammed into the guy holding Karen so hard that they both crashed to the side of the van, and Karen fell down. I turned to grab a second guy by the shoulders and yanked him backwards onto the pavement by his hoodie, and Bart just started yelling for help while Kathy cried hysterically. The bald driver guy jumped up and said, "Get her in the van!" Karen managed to bite the hand covering her mouth, and the guy holding her cursed and loosened his grip just enough for Paul to pull her free. One of the guys swung at me and clipped the side of my face hard enough to make my ears ring, and I kind of stumbled backwards while Paul shoved Karen behind him. Then someone nearby yelled that police were coming, and all the guys bolted. Two of the guys dove back into the van while the others sprinted around the corner, and tires screeched as the van peeled away into traffic, so fast that the sliding door was still partly open. For several seconds, none of us moved or said anything. Karen collapsed onto the sidewalk, sobbing uncontrollably, and Kathy held onto her while Bart kept shouting for someone to call 911, even though several people already had. That's when Paul pointed at the street beside the curb. There, lying on the edge of the street lamp's light, were 2 rolls of duct tape and a bunch of pairs of pantyhose that were knotted up funny. When I looked at them, they were knotted with slip knots, obviously going to be used to tie somebody up. The police arrived within minutes, and they separated all of us and took statements while flashing lights just reflected across the monuments in the distance. The officers searched the area for hours, but they never found the van or the guys. One detective quietly told one of our teacher chaperones that we were lucky things hadn't gotten worse. None of us slept that night. Karen barely spoke the rest of the trip, and Kathy refused to leave the hotel unless teachers were nearby. Bart tried acting normal, but every time we saw a dark van anywhere near us, he got nervous. And Paul blamed himself for not reacting faster, even though he was the one who probably saved Karen's life. The last day in D.C., we passed crowds of tourists laughing and taking pictures like nothing bad could ever happen there. But for us, the city no longer looked exciting or historic. We didn't care. We just wanted to go home. Every time I see footage of Washington at night now, I find myself scanning the background for a black van slowly following behind a group of kids who have no idea they're being hunted. Of course, that's never the case, but that thought still sticks in my head. Those guys never got caught, and I hope nobody else ever fell into their trap. Theater Terror, submitted by Kiki. Looking back at my senior year of high school, I don't see the usual golden memories of prom or graduation that so many people talk about. Instead, in my mind, I see the pale, sharp face of a girl who almost ended my life before it even got started. I was 17 years old, which feels like a lifetime ago. now that I'm just working a boring office job, but the trauma of that spring is still wired into my brain like a permanent scar. It all started when the casting list for our school's production of The Addams Family was posted on the auditorium doors. I'd been a theater geek since freshman year and always stuck in the ensemble or playing the wacky neighbor roles, so when I saw my name next to Morticia Addams, I actually screamed. It was the second lead, the role I had spent weeks practicing for in front of my mirror, and for a few minutes I was on top of the world. But standing right next to me was Chloe, a girl who had been the star of our department since middle school, and she was staring at the list with an expression that I can only describe as pure, unadulterated hatred. She'd been cast as Alice, a great role, honestly, but she wanted Morticia. She didn't say a word to me that day. She just turned on her heel and walked away, and that's when the air in the drama department started to feel heavy. The sabotage started out small enough that I could almost convince myself I was just being clumsy or forgetful. During the second week of rehearsals, I went to put on my character's shoes and found the insides coated with a thick, sticky layer of some kind of wood glue that had partially dried and ruined the leather, and it made it impossible to slide my feet in without ripping my skin. I figured maybe it was just somebody messing around in the costume shop. But then my script went missing from my locker, which was locked, only to turn up 3 days later in the girls' bathroom, soaked in toilet water and shredded to pieces. I tried to tell our director, Mr. H, that someone was targeting me, but he just patted my shoulder and told me that the pressure of one of the lead parts was making me paranoid, and that I should just focus on my lines. It's funny how people dismiss a girl's intuition as drama right up until things get dangerous, because if someone had listened to me then, maybe the rest of the month wouldn't have been a living nightmare. By the time we hit Tech Week, the pranks transitioned into something much more calculated and sinister. One evening while I was on stage practicing the "Death is Just Around the Corner" number, I felt something sharp plunge into the side of my calf. I looked down and saw that someone had sewn a bunch of sewing needles into the hem of my long, floor-length black dress, and they were angled in a way that they stayed hidden until I moved in a certain direction. And then they poked right into my legs. I was bleeding through the fabric and shaking as I pulled the dress off in the wings, and that's when I saw Chloe standing by the prop table, just watching me with this blank, glassy-eyed stare. She didn't offer to help, she just stood there and took a sip of her water. But then I noticed an ever so slight smile went across her face. That night I went home and checked my social media, only to find that someone had created a burner account using my name and was sending disgusting and hateful messages to the younger kids in the cast, effectively turning half the ensemble against me before I even walked through the door the next morning. But the first time I truly feared for my life was during our first dress rehearsal in front of a small invited audience of parents. There's a scene that I had to sit in a high-backed Victorian chair that was supposed to be on a small platform. As I sat down with all the poise of Morticia, I felt the entire structure give way beneath me. Someone had partially sawed through the supports of the platform and loosened the bolts on the chair legs, causing the whole damn thing to collapse backward off the stage riser. I fell nearly 5 feet onto the hard concrete floor of the pit and just barely missed a row of music stands. I ended up with a mild concussion and a bruised rib, but the school administration, they called it a structural failure and blamed the aging stage equipment. I knew better, though, because while I was lying on that cold floor gasping for air and trying to figure out if I could move my legs, I looked up and saw Chloe standing in the shadows of the wings, holding something behind her. I couldn't tell what it was, but I could take a guess. Despite the terror, I finished the run of the show because I was 17 and stubborn, and I didn't want to let her win. After graduation, Chloe and I went to different colleges, and I blocked her on everything, trying to put that horrific spring behind me. But a few years later, this past July to be exact, the truth finally crawled out of the dark. An anonymous post went viral on a high school confessions page for our hometown, and it was written by someone who had been Chloe's best friend at the time. The post was a massive, detailed manifesto explaining how Chloe had spent months documenting her war against me, including photos she had taken of my shredded script and the needles that she'd stolen from the costume shop. This friend had been too scared to say anything back then, but Chloe had recently spiraled into some kind of legal trouble, and the friend felt she had to come clean. Within hours, the post was linked to Chloe's real name, and the police actually got involved because some of the things she'd done, like tampering with the stage equipment, they said that constituted felony assault. I was sitting in my parents' living room on a humid Tuesday night just scrolling through the comments on that post when I heard a heavy thud against the front door. My parents were in the kitchen cleaning up dinner, and I thought it was just a late Amazon delivery, until the thudding turned into a frantic, rhythmic pounding that shook the entire door frame. I walked toward the entryway, my heart going nuts, and I looked through the sidelight window. It was Chloe, but not the polished theater star Chloe that I remembered. Her hair was matted and greasy, her eyes were wide and bloodshot, and she was clutching a heavy tire iron in one hand and a red can of something in the other. I'd find out later it was gas. She began screaming my name, her voice cracking and sounding like broken glass, and accused me of stealing her life, and said that if the world was going to see her as a monster, she was going to make sure I wasn't around to watch it happen. The next few minutes were a blur of absolute paralyzing panic. Chloe swung the tire iron against the glass of the front door and shattered the pane into a bunch of shards. And then she started dumping the gasoline through the hole and onto our hardwood floors. The smell was instant and overwhelming, that sharp chemical sting that tells your brain that something's very, very bad. My dad tackled me into the kitchen just as Chloe flicked a lighter, and for a second, I thought my parents' whole house was going to go up in flames, but thankfully, the gas that she had spread on the floor hadn't spread far enough. My mom was on the phone with 911 screaming our address, and my dad grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the hallway and sprayed it through the broken door, blinding Chloe and soaking the gasoline so it couldn't catch. Did that stop her? Nope. Chloe began climbing through the broken window like something out of a horror movie. Her clothes were dripping with gas, and her face was just this mask of rage. She swung the tire iron wildly and smashed a ceramic vase on the entry table that my mom loved, and she grazed my dad's shoulder. I was backed into the corner of the dining room and had picked up a steak knife from the table from our dinner. I was genuinely prepared to have to kill this woman to survive. She started staggering around in our house, and just as she lunged at me, the front yard was flooded with blue and red lights. And shortly after, 2 officers stormed through the open door with their tasers drawn. They hit her right as she was mid-swing, and Chloe crumpled to the floor. It turned out that after the social media post went live, Chloe had suffered a complete psychotic break. She'd been stalking my location for weeks, the apartment that I lived in, and for some reason knew that I was home visiting my parents. All of this fueled by a 7-year-old grudge that had rotted her mind from the inside out. When they hauled her away in the back of that cruiser, she wasn't even looking at the cops. She was staring at me through the window. I spent the rest of that summer in therapy, jumping at every loud noise and checking the locks on my apartment door 3 times before I went to bed. It's been a long while now, and I know she's tucked away in a high-security psychiatric facility, but I still can't look at a theater program or hear a certain show tune without feeling that phantom sting of the needles in my skin, falling backwards onto that floor, and then the terrifying evening I had at my parents' house. All this is just a terrifying reminder that for some people, the play never actually ends, and the villain doesn't always stay on the stage. For me, she showed up 7 years later. Strange People at the Race, submitted by Funky Terry. In the fall of 1979, yeah, I'm an old guy, I was a junior on the varsity cross-country team at my high school. Back then, cross-country wasn't treated like football or basketball. Probably still isn't today. I mean, nobody cared much about us runners except our parents and the occasional girlfriend who showed up to a meet wearing our school colors. We rode around on the old school buses and ran through muddy parks and forest preserves and usually finished our Saturdays sore, exhausted, and half frozen. But the meet I still think about happened in October at this tiny rural school somewhere outside of northern Illinois farmland. Honestly, I couldn't tell you the exact town anymore because most of us had never heard of it before that day. It was a nearly 2-hour bus trip to get there. I do remember the roads just getting narrower and narrower the farther away from our school we drove, until it felt like we were heading into the middle of nowhere. Then again, we were. Cornfields stretched forever on both sides of the bus and were broken up only by patches of woods and old farmhouses sitting really far back from the road. The course itself was strange from the get-go. It started behind the school, then cut through a huge field, and then disappeared into a mile of woods before looping back around. I remember one of our coaches joking that if somebody collapsed out there, they wouldn't find the body until spring. And that's not to say that there weren't people posted out there, but my coach, the card. There were probably 100 runners lined up at the starting line from different schools, and it was cold enough that we could see everyone's breath hanging in the air. I remember feeling really good that day. Nervous, but good. When the starting pistol went off, we all surged forward across the grass, and the first mile was normal. Parents and friends clapping from the sidelines and kids shouting out splits, and the pack slowly spread apart. Then we entered the woods. The trail narrowed immediately. Fallen leaves were covering most of the ground, and tree branches hung low enough that you had to duck sometimes while running. The noise from the crowd disappeared fast, and pretty soon all I could hear was breathing and shoes hitting dirt and the occasional bird taking off deeper into the trees. I was running beside my teammate David when we came around a bend and saw them. There were 6 or 7 people, sitting in lawn chairs about 15 feet off the trail. They were dressed all in white, and it looked like they were almost wearing hospital gowns or bathrobes. Every single one of them had dark stains all over the white fabric, and from a distance it looked a lot like blood. None of them spoke or moved. They just sat there facing the trail as dozens of high school runners passed them by. I do recall one of them was an older woman with gray hair hanging in her face, and another was this really tall guy who wasn't wearing shoes despite the cold weather. I also recall seeing what looked like blood smeared around his mouth and down the front of his chest. David swore loudly beside me, and a runner from another school actually stumbled off the trail because he was staring at them instead of watching his footing. The worst part was the expressions on their face. They weren't angry, and they weren't smiling either. They just looked completely emotionless, like mannequins propped up in chairs. As I passed them, one of the women slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were so pale, they almost didn't look real. I remember thinking crazily that her eyes looked like the vampires from the movie Omega Man. I ran the rest of that race, terrified out of my mind. When we reached the finish line, kids from every school were talking over each other about the people in the woods. One of the runners was even crying. Another freshman threw up behind the team bus, and coaches initially thought we were exaggerating, until enough runners from different schools described the exact same thing. Within 15 minutes, police cars started arriving. I remember standing with my team near the parking lot while officers questioned runners one by one, and soon police and volunteers were heading into the woods with flashlights, even though it was still daylight. They were out there for a good 45 minutes. They didn't find anything. They came back and said there weren't any chairs, there weren't any footprints, there weren't any bathrobes, there was nothing at all. By the time we finally left, it was mid-afternoon. Nobody was laughing on the ride home this time. The bus was dead silent except for the engine rattling beneath us. A few minutes after pulling away from the school, though, our bus curved along a road bordering another section of woods that were connected to that course. One of my friends from the team, a young lady, screamed, and everybody looked out the windows at once. Standing between the trees were 2 figures in those white bathrobes or whatever they were wearing. You could still see the stains covering the fabric, too. They stood perfectly still, side by side near the edge of the woods, and as our bus passed by, both of them slowly raised their arms and waved goodbye to us. Strangest cross-country meet, one that I'll never forget. When I moved in 1988, submitted by Jerry Jams. When my dad told us that my family was moving from Colorado to Huntington Beach, California in the summer of 1988, I thought I'd hit the lottery. I was starting my junior year, and the idea of swapping heavy winter coats for shorts and more places to skate seemed like a dream come true. I was an avid skater, and all of my friends had even built a half-pipe out in the woods in our neighborhood. I was totally into it, as many other kids were. California made me think of surfing and more skating. We pulled into a neighborhood filled with palm trees and sun-bleached houses one weekend, and within a week I timidly went down to a board shop to poke around. The owner asked if I had ever been out in the water, and I told him that not only wasn't I any good at surfing, I'd never tried, and that I was only a skater. Then I heard this shrill laugh behind me, and a voice saying, "We can fix that, dude." That would become a mantra I'd use for the rest of my life. Before I knew it, I was shaking the hand of Lance, one of the gnarliest humans I've ever called a friend. And the next thing I knew after that, I fell in with a crew of guys who didn't care where I was from, didn't care about much other than surfing and skating. They were the locals, the skaters and the surf rats, guys who lived for the pier and parking lots to skate in. The fact that I could already skate made it easier, and I met a lot of guys that people saw in the magazines and on TV. I'm not going to name them, but if you were a skater, you know them. Lance was tall and had bleached hair and a scarred-up face from a dozen different slams, and he lived with this kind of manic energy that made people either love him or want to get the hell away from him. But to me, he was just my friend. All those guys were. And for a few months, life felt perfect. Things, though, shifted when a girl named Jamie started noticing me. She was a cheerleader, the kind of girl who seemed like she belonged on a billboard for clothing or suntan lotion or something. I couldn't believe she was even talking to the new guy from Colorado. The guys in the crew warned me, especially Lance, and told me that the jocks at our school didn't take kindly to the freaks moving in on their territory. Even though I was still a new guy and making friends everywhere, I was a freak. But I was also 16, and Jamie was beautiful. She had this way of looking at me that made me feel like I was the only person in the world, and by the end of October we were officially dating. I felt like I was balancing two different worlds, the gritty, salt-stained life of surfing and skating during the day, and the polished high-status world of the popular kids on the weekends. I knew Jamie had an ex-boyfriend named Ronnie, who was a star football player. A dude who looked like he'd been carved out of granite and probably spent more time on steroids than he did in class. But Jamie told me it was over between them. He was ancient history. I wanted to believe her because it felt good to be the one that she had chosen. The night everything went wrong started out as a normal Friday. We went to see a movie at a theater near us, and everything felt good. We were holding hands and talking about nothing as we walked through the parking lot toward her car. And I never saw the black Jeep Wagoneer until we were right on top of it. The doors swung open simultaneously, and 4 gargantuas got out. One of them was Ronnie, looking even bigger and meaner under the flickering orange light of those terrible parking lot lights. For some reason, he just looked bigger than ever. Didn't even look like he had a neck. But his eyes had this frantic look that made my stomach drop into my shoes. I felt Jamie's hand slip out of mine, and she didn't even move toward me or away. She just stood there silent and still, and I tried to play it cool, asking what was going on. But Ronnie didn't say a word before he was in my face. The first punch caught me in the ribs and sent me gasping against the side of Jamie's car. Before I could even recover, another guy grabbed my arms from behind and pinned me against the cold metal while Ronnie went to work on me. It wasn't like a movie fight. No fight is. It was messy and brutal. I was getting my ass handed to me, and every time his fist connected with my stomach or my face, I felt a sickening thud that seemed to echo throughout my body and skull. I could even hear the sound of my own teeth clicking together. For a second, I looked at Jamie, hoping that she'd yell or call for help, but she just stood by the side of the Jeep, watching with an expression that looked more like boredom than fear. It was the most terrifying realization of my life, that this person that I cared about, that said she cared about me, was just watching me get dismantled, and apparently didn't feel a thing. Ronnie finally let up, but he was breathing like a wounded animal. He started screaming about how I didn't belong in California, and how I was just some Midwest trash trying to act like a local. The more he talked, the more I realized he wasn't just angry about this girl. He was off his fucking rocker. Then things got much worse. Ronnie reached into his pocket and pulled out a folding knife. I remember hearing the blade flick open. He grabbed my hair and pulled my head back, exposing my throat, and for a second I thought, Jesus Christ, I'm going to die. But then he lowered the blade to my cheek, and he said he was going to give me a permanent reminder of why I should have stayed in Colorado. Like it was my choice to move out here in the first place. I could feel the cold, sharp edge of the steel start to press against my skin, and I tried to move away, but the other guy was still holding on to me, and I was still really dizzy from the blows to my head. I just closed my eyes and waited for the pain of the blade, and for a second, I thought I was just going to be mangled in this parking lot, while the girl of my dreams stood there doing nothing. The silence of the scene was only broken by the sound of Ronnie's heavy, steroid-fueled breathing. But then, the sound of a roaring engine and the screech of tires tore through the tension. The beat-up primer gray van I was so familiar with its surf racks on top slammed to a halt just feet away from us, and before the dust had even settled, the doors flew open. It was Lance and my crew. Lance didn't come out with a weapon. He came out like a human hurricane, screaming at the top of his lungs with this madness in his eyes that made Ronnie's roid rage look like a child's tantrum. Suddenly, there were 4 of them. 2 of them were wielding skateboard decks like clubs, and Lance didn't hesitate for a second. He didn't care that Ronnie was bigger than him. He flew through the air and tackled him right off me. The knife went flying off into the night. I mean, these jocks were big, but they weren't used to people who actually liked to fight, and did it all the time. And my friends were the kind of guys who grew up falling onto concrete for fun to boot. The parking lot turned into a chaotic blur of swinging skateboards, frantic shouting, as the freaks absolutely tore into these dicks. I looked over for a second to see Lance on top of Ronnie, raining down punches with a terrifying speed, shouting things that didn't even sound like English. The jocks, who just a few minutes ago had been so brave when it was 4 against 1, quickly realized they were outmatched by these guys, who had zero regard for their own safety. The guy holding me let go and tried to help Ronnie, and I just kind of fell to the ground, my face throbbing and my vision blurry. But my vision wasn't blurry enough, because I watched as Jamie finally moved. She didn't move towards me. She went over to the Jeep, and when Ronnie finally managed to scramble away from Lance, she actually helped him get into the passenger seat, and then she got in too, leaving her car in the parking lot. They took off, and the 2 other jocks were standing there trying to fend for themselves, but they eventually ran. My buddies didn't chase them. They just stood in the middle of the lot, breathing hard and looking like some kind of post-apocalyptic tribe with their battered boards and their hair all messed up. Lance walked over to me and was wiping blood off his knuckles onto his pants, and he reached a hand down to pull me up. He didn't ask if I was okay or tell me everything would be fine. He just looked at me and said that we were going to the beach to hang out. The other guys actually started laughing. I mean, they really enjoyed what they'd just been through. I sat in the back of the van, feeling the cold air on my swelling face, and I looked out the window at the beautiful palm trees and the glowing lights of the Huntington Beach Strip. It was in that moment that I'd been afraid of all the wrong things. I'd spent all summer worried about the heavy waves and the undertow that could trap you against the bottom of the ocean should I try surfing, but that was just nature doing what it did. The real danger out here wasn't the water or the sharks. It was the people who looked perfect on the outside, but had something rotten and empty in the middle. The rich jock kids and the girls who cheered for them were far scarier than any wave I would ever face there. I'd moved to California looking for paradise, but that night I learned under all that golden sun and blue water, there was a darkness that the tourists never stayed long enough to see. I guess it's the kind of darkness that's in every town no matter where you go. I'm still friends with Lance, who is still a maniac, but he's a good father and owns his own surf shop. My kids adore him. I can never thank him enough for saving my ass that night. But any time that it comes up, he always just says, "Nah, brah, I was needing a fight that night anyway." I've been listening to your channel for a long, long time, and I recall that you still skate, Uncle Jay. I do too. That part of me is the truest part of me, and I bet you understand. Thanks for sharing this if you decide to.
Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything: a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.